mean, some of us ate dirt as children, right? And y'all look okay. Nobody looks the worst. We drank out of hose pipes growing up. Anybody drink out of a hose pipe? Well, you ain't lived till you drink out of a hose pipe. God knows what was in the hose pipe. And now it's filtration systems and purifications and all this kind of stuff. Walk into any store and you'll see shelves full of antibacterial soaps, sanitizers, air purifiers, gluten-free products, and everything organic. We worry about the pollutants in our water, the toxins in our food, and the chemicals in our cleaning products. We carry little bottles of hand sanitizer like armor against invisible threats. And during the global pandemic, if you do remember, we learned just how much cleanliness matters. Washing our hands was conveyed to us as an act of love. Avoiding contamination became a public virtue. While we've gotten better at cleansing our hands, and I'll have to say even I've gotten better at that, thanks to my wife, who is she's not an extreme germaphobe, but she's she's on that side of it. We've forgotten how to cleanse our hearts. We've gotten better at cleaning our hands, but not so good at cleansing our hearts. While we disinfect our surfaces, we'll tolerate corruption in our souls. While we avoid contaminated food, we consume spiritual toxins with barely a blink. We are meticulous about our outer hygiene, but we are blind to our inner uncleanness. And here's where the Bible speaks, especially in the book of Leviticus. Listen, because Leviticus doesn't just teach about physical cleanliness, which it does. It teaches us about spiritual defilement, about how living in a fallen world corrupts us, not just on the outside, but deep within, and how a holy God deals with unholy people. Now, again, I'm going to admit, reading through Leviticus chapter 13 through 18 was pretty tough sledding this week. And did you catch on? It seemed like the harder the chapters are, the longer they are. Like, why do we have to have so many verses? I mean, like the easier chapters to read, we had like 20 verses. And then we get to 13 and we're like, how many were there in 13? I mean, it was like multiple pages in my Bible. I was like, good Lord. 59 verses on leprosy. Skin diseases, bodily discharges. I know y'all love that part. Mold on walls, dietary restrictions, forbidden sexual relations. Most of us skim through these chapters and think, oh, what in the world does this have to do with following Jesus today? But that question is exactly why we need to slow down and listen. Because these chapters, listen, they aren't about biology and behavior. They're about God's holiness and our need for cleansing. So listen, you see, holiness is not just about being moral. And that's what that is so much of what we think holiness is about today. It's just about being moral. But that's not what holiness is. Holiness is set apart, distinct, different. And God was teaching Israel, and He's teaching us by teaching Israel that living with Him in a fallen world requires radical commitment to purity, not just of the body, but more importantly, the heart. In these chapters 13 through 18 that we read this week, reveal that God is not only interested in what happens in the sanctuary, right? Here in the gathering. God is really concerned about what happens in our kitchen, the bedroom, and in our bloodstream. He's not just concerned with religious life. God claims authority over all of life. And yet, if I'm honest, if you're honest, we know we can't keep ourselves clean, right? Why? Because we just live in a polluted world. And we carry this pollution still within us. And that's where the gospel breaks in. Because while Leviticus shows us the weight of our uncleanness, it also points us to the only one who can carry our uncleanness away. So here's the big idea. I haven't done this in a while. I thought I'd bring it back at least maybe for this sermon. What's the big idea? If you were to leave here today and put this sermon, these 6 chapters into one sentence to explain it, I think this is the way we would do it. God calls his people to live distinctly in a defiled world, but only Christ can make us truly clean. God calls his people to live distinctly in a defiled world, but only Christ can make us truly clean. So let's take a look. You got your Bibles open. Your device is open. Let's take a look at this ancient book. But let's look. Sometimes here's what we'll do. We will sit back and we'll act like spectators looking into an ancient world, into a foreign culture. But we need to see this as desperate people who are looking for hope. A hope found not in our ritual performance, but in the cleansing grace of Jesus Christ. Since God calls his people to live distinctly in a defiled world, and if we can't cleanse ourselves by some kind of ritual effort, then where does that leave us this morning? And you may say, well, how in the world do we cleanse ourselves of by ritual effort today? Some of us have come here this morning thinking that by being here, this somehow is a ritual cleansing, but because by coming to church, we're making ourselves right with God. Since God calls his people to live distinctly in a defiled world, and if we can't cleanse ourselves by ritual effort, then where does this leave us? Well, that brings us to the very first chapter that we read this week, chapter 13. Here, God begins not by calling Israel to storm the gates of Canaan or to perform heroic religious acts. He begins by teaching them how to recognize uncleanness. Now, you know what? You would think being able to understand that we are unclean would be something easy for us to do. But do you know how many people in our modern world that you talk to, and if you were to ask them, do they think that they're good enough to go to heaven? Do you know how many people really believe that they're good enough to go to heaven? Which means they don't see themselves as unclean. Either that or they don't understand the requirements to get into heaven. I distinctly remember meeting a guy in the East Aboga community when I served there years ago. And he told us, we were trying to share the gospel with him. And he clearly, his neighbor was a devout churchgoer. Matter of fact, he said his neighbor was well known in the church community for certain accomplishments. I won't give him any details because I don't want to give somebody might pick up on this and know who it is, and that's not what's relevant. And what he told me was, he said, you see that house beside his house? I said, yes, sir. He said, do you know, he said, I go over, he said, I cut that lady's grass, I take her garbage to the road, I do this, I do that, I do this, I do that. And he said, the guy beside her, you know, the church guy, the guy that everybody knows, the guy that has a reputation within the Christian community. He said, you know, he's never cut her grass, he's never taken her garbage to the road, he's never gone over and helped her do anything. He said, so it is my belief that when I stand before God and he asks me why should he let me into his heaven? He said, I will be able to stand on my own merit. He said, there's no way that guy's a Christian. And I said, you know what? I would say by his actions, his Christianity could definitely be questionable. I said, but only God knows the heart. But we can judge fruit, and the fruit seems to be lacking to some degree. But I said, I can tell you one thing that is for sure. Your actions, no matter how many they are or how great they are never sufficient to overcome the sin that's in your life. And your actions are not good enough to make you good enough to be right with God. You see, he was trying to clean his life up through his actions, and yet what he realized, his actions could not make him clean. They only further left him unclean. So let's look at the first truth from Leviticus chapter 13 through 15. Holiness requires distinction. In these 3 chapters, God outlines various cases of ceremonial uncleanness, skin diseases like leprosy, mold and mildew in garments and homes in chapter 14, and bodily discharges, there it was, chapter 15. And again, we're not dealing with sinful acts, but listen, symbols, tangible reminders of the brokenness of life in a fallen world. And so physical unclean, this whole thing of being physically unclean, it is a parable, a story, a picture of spiritual defilement. So this chapter 13 opens with instructions for identifying and diagnosing skin diseases. The word translated leprosy actually refers to a range of skin conditions and even mildew-like rot in garments and homes. But regardless of the cause, the result is the same. The person is declared, listen, unclean, and here's the key, placed outside the camp. Now that phrase is important for your New Testament understanding as well. Look at Leviticus chapter 13, verse 46. He shall remain unclean as long as he has the disease. He is unclean. He shall live alone. His dwelling, do you see it? Shall be outside the camp. Why is that phrase important? Because do you know what the book of Hebrews, and this verse is not going to be on the screen, you know what the book of Hebrews says that Jesus was crucified? Outside the camp, outside the city, outside away from people. This was not punishment, it was protection. God was dwelling in the camp, and where God is, holiness must reign. Sin and death, even in symbolic form, could not remain in his presence without consequence. This system showed Israel that holiness and impurity are not compatible. To be near God, you must be clean. But here's the lesson. External diseases were a metaphor for internal pollution. These outward blemishes, they pointed towards a deeper truth, that uncleanness lives, listen, inside of you and inside of me, inside of every human heart. Mark chapter 7, listen to what Jesus says, okay? This is so important. And he said, what comes out of a person is what defiles him. For from within, out of the heart of man come evil thoughts, sexual immorality, theft, murder, adultery, coveting, wickedness, deceit, sensuality, envy, slander, pride, and foolishness. So God used skin conditions, mold, and bodily fluids to say this. This is what your soul looks like without me. This is how sin spreads. It spreads slowly and invisibly. But listen, it spreads thoroughly. In chapter 14, the priest is given specific instructions for how to examine a person who may be healing from a disease. There's even a cleansing ritual involving 2 birds. Do you remember this? One is what? Killed. The other one is released. Why this detail? Because uncleanness in Leviticus is like spiritual radiation. It contaminates anything that it touches. People, clothing, walls, beds. And once defilement begins, This is worth coming this morning. Once it begins, you can't stop it by willpower. It spreads unless dealt with by God's appointed means. This is a picture of how sin works. It always contaminates. It never stays small. It touches your relationships, your mind, your worship, and you cannot quarantine it with good behavior. In fact, the rituals of Leviticus highlight how helpless we are in our uncleanness. You didn't heal yourself. The priest had to examine you. A sacrifice had to be made. Only then, and only then, could you re-enter the camp. So what's the application for us? We live in a culture that tells us we're basically clean. And if we're not, we can fix it, right, by a good old self-care plan or just better habits. How many of you are planning on doing something better tomorrow? Huh? How many of you said, man, I didn't eat good this weekend. I gotta start tomorrow, Monday. Got to get better on Monday. Got to start eating better. I didn't go work out this week. I didn't walk this week. I didn't get my 10,000 steps in every day. Tomorrow, I'm back on it. But Leviticus says otherwise. We don't need reform. We need cleansing. And not just from the outside, but from the inside. But, chapter 15, really, something stood out there that, for me, never stood out before. Sometimes I think we look at these things far too deeply. We overanalyze the text, right? Like we're looking for some hidden truth in between the lines. I'm not saying we shouldn't do that. But sometimes we look so hard that we literally bog ourselves down and miss what is just right there on the surface. And this is what I wrote down. God cares about all of life. Chapter 15 deals with bodily discharges, male and female. And again, we might ask, why is God concerned about such private matters? Because there's no part of life that's outside of God's concern. I need that. I need to be reminded of that. Because sometimes I think God's only concerned about certain aspects of my life. And yet this chapter, in all of its weirdness and uncomfortableness in reading it, reminds me that God cares about everything about me. He's not just the God of the sanctuary. He's God of the bedroom, the hospital room, the kitchen, the closet. Leviticus teaches us that God's holiness is not compartmentalized. He just doesn't want our church life. He wants all of life. So what's the takeaway in these chapters, 13 through 15? It isn't just about skin conditions and ceremonial washings. It's a picture, a vivid picture, sometimes an uncomfortable picture of a deeper reality. That God is holy, that we're unclean, and only He can make us clean. He calls us to live distinctly, to be visibly set apart from the world that no longer feels the weight of impurity. And in doing so, He points us to a deeper need, not just to behave differently, but to be made new. But if our uncleanliness is so serious and it affects every part of our life, then how can anyone ever be clean enough to come into God's presence? And if you've been here the last couple of weeks, you've probably been saying, man, you keep asking that question over and over again. Who is clean enough to come into God's presence? That's the most important question in all of life. We sung Amazing Grace last week. How do you sing Amazing Grace with the most emotion that you can sing it with? Only when you understand the depths of your uncleanliness and uncleanness and the depths that He went to make you clean so that you could come into His presence, not on a cleanliness of your own, but one that had been given to you by faith. That leads us to the second point. Did you know that Leviticus 16 is on your calendar? Did you know that? It's on your calendar. You say, I didn't know that. Have you ever seen on your calendar in the fall of the year a holiday called Yom Kippur? Yom-Kippur, Yom Kippur. That's Leviticus 16. It's the Day of Atonement. And what does the Day of Atonement say? Holiness requires atonement. Holiness requires atonement. So when we left off in chapters 13 through 15, we're faced with this problem. Uncleanness is pervasive. It touches skin, clothing, bodily fluids, and even homes. But beneath all of that lies a deeper issue, sin. Not just symbolic impurity, but moral guilt before a holy God. So how does that guilt get dealt with? How can people who are constantly becoming unclean ever hope to dwell with a God who says, be holy as I am holy? The answer comes in Leviticus 16, the Day of Atonement. This is the theological center of the book, and in many ways, the heartbeat of the entire Old Testament system. So let's walk through this very quickly. First, the seriousness of God's presence. The chapter begins in verse 1. Look at verse 1, 16. The Lord spoke to Moses after the death of the two sons of Aaron when they drew near before the Lord and died. We talked about that last week. Oh, Nadab and Abihu. You know, they got killed for strange fire. This tragedy underscores something vital. God's holiness is not optional. His presence is not safe. That's why Leviticus 16 exists, because people need a God-ordained way to come near. They need atonement. The word atonement means to cover, to reconcile, to cleanse of guilt. Remember, the opening words of Leviticus 1:1 was an invitation to come near. God wants us to be near him. But God is not going to ignore your sin. He's going to deal with it, and he's going to do it on his terms. So there's a structure in the atonement. 2 goats, 1 substitute. Look at verses 6 through 10. I won't read them, but there you're introduced to 2 goats. Both are part of a single offering, but they both perform different roles, right? The first goat, he sacrificed. Bad to be that goat, right? He sacrificed. Its blood is brought into the Holy of Holies, and it's sprinkled onto the mercy seat. This was that propitiatory, that means to satisfy God's wrath, propitiation, through substitutionary death. Then the second goat, we know this goat because we know the term. It's called the what? The scapegoat. And the scapegoat was not killed. Instead, the high priest laid his hands on the head and confessed all the sins of Israel, symbolically transferring their guilt. Then it was sent into the wilderness, bearing their sin away. How many of you are familiar with the verse that says, he remembers our sin no more as far as the east is from the west? What? It's carried away as far as the east is from the west. Again, kind of hearkening back to this scapegoat that takes our sin away, never to come back and ever be remembered again. Look at verses 21 and 22 of Leviticus 16. And Aaron shall lay both his hands on the head of the live goat and confess over it all the iniquities of Israel and all their transgressions and all their sins. And he shall put them on the head of the goat and send it away into the wilderness by the hand of the man who is in readiness. The goat shall bear all their iniquities on itself to a remote area, and he shall let the goat go free in the wilderness. This is what we might call theology in motion. One goat dies, the other disappears. One satisfies God, the other removes the people's guilt. Both are needed because we not only need forgiveness, we need cleansing. Not only pardon, but we need peace. But let's look at this high priest. None of this happens without what we call a mediator or a high priest. Aaron, he's the only high priest left. You remember we had 3? We got 2 of them eliminated all in one whack. I think Fred brought it up last week. He said, man, can you imagine? He said, what'd you say? There's like 2 million of these Jews? And now we're down to 1 priest for 2 million people? And I said, yeah, I'm glad I'm not a priest. I mean, think about it. I mean, it's a pretty tough job. But here's Aaron. He's the high priest. He couldn't just walk in the Holy of Holies whenever he pleased. He had to come with blood, first for his own sins, then for the other. The priest had to bathe, put on a special garment, and carry out the entire ritual exactly as prescribed. Some of us would be killed because we don't read directions. Very important to read directions, especially when it comes to God, or you'd be dead. My wife would have been one of them. That's a running joke at our house. She never reads directions. I read directions, and God has preserved us for 27 years together of trying to put stuff together, with one trying to read the directions and the other one just said, hey, it just goes like this and just do this. Thank God for his mercy and grace towards us. Which, putting something together before we got married almost caused us not to get married, did it not, honey? And we knew then, when we made it through the Christmas, a Christmas entertainment system that we were putting together, that we would probably make it all the way to the end, because we survived probably the biggest fight to this day that we've ever had. So, but you had to read the directions. You had to follow it to a T. Why? Because this is sacred ground. God is coming near, and sinful man needed a go-between. It's a picture of our desperate need for a high priest, someone who is clean enough to stand before God and gracious enough to represent us, and that brings us to Jesus. When we get to Easter, you know what Easter is? It is the fulfillment of Leviticus chapter 16. It is the reality of the Day of Atonement, not with the sacrifice of animals, but the sacrifice of a son. Listen to Hebrews 9, 11, and 12. But when Christ appeared as a high priest of the good things that have come, then through the greater, more perfect tent, not made with hands, that is, not of this creation. So look, it's talking about the tent where they're doing all the sacrifices. Now the tent is a body that is a tent. Jesus is the tabernacle. That's why when it says in John 1:14 that the Word became flesh and dwelt or tabernacled amongst us, the tabernacle took on human flesh. He entered once and for all into the Holy of Holies, not by means of the blood of goats and calves, but by means of his own blood, thus securing an eternal redemption. So Jesus fulfills every aspect of the Day of Atonement. He is the priest who goes in not once a year, but once and for all. He is the sacrifice whose blood cleanses the mercy seat, heaven itself. He is the scapegoat who carries our sins into the wilderness as far as the east is from the west. He does not need to offer himself. He is sinless. He does not come trembling. He comes as the beloved Son. And on the cross, Jesus takes both roles. He absorbs God's wrath. That's the sacrifice. And he removes our guilt of sin, which is the scapegoat. He was consumed so that we could be covered. Look at this verse. You know this verse. We have heard this verse, 2 Corinthians 5:21, our entire lives. For our sake, God, made him, Jesus, to be sin, who knew no sin, so that in him, Jesus, we, unclean people, might become the very righteousness of God. So the people of Israel had to repeat this every year. Every year they waited. Every year they wondered, will the high priest survive? Will God accept his sacrifice? But we don't have to worry about that. Why? Because back to Hebrews chapter 10, verse 12. But when Christ had offered for all time a single sacrifice for sins, this may be some of the best wording in your Bible. He sat down at the right hand of God. You know the one thing a priest never did when he was on duty? He never sat down. Why? Because sin was so great that sacrifices constantly had to be made. But Jesus, the great high priest, he is seated right now at the right hand of the Father. Why? Because he uttered these words from the cross, "It is finished," and he rested. Why? Because the work of sin is done. Peace with God is possible through the sacrifice of this Son. You don't need to atone for your past. You don't need to prove your worth. You don't need to live in guilt over sins already confessed. The blood has been shed, the sacrifice has been accepted, and the scapegoat has carried it away. Can I tell you what I told you last week? 3 words. You, if you're Christian, you are clean. You're clean. Holiness requires atonement. God is not going to sweep your sin under the rug. He is going to deal with it, and he has dealt with it through a substitute, Jesus Christ. He is the center of the Christian life. He is the day of atonement in flesh and blood. He alone brings sinners into the presence of a holy God, and he does it once and for all. So far we've seen that God's holiness requires distinction and it requires atonement. But here's my last piece this morning. Chapter 17 and 18 says holiness requires moral purity, which means it shapes how we live every day of our life. Holiness must be practiced, especially in the way we honor life and uphold purity. Chapter 17 and 18, God moves from the rituals of the tabernacle to the realities of life. He teaches Israel, and by extension us, that holiness must shape how we live. Worship doesn't end when you walk out that door this morning. Holiness isn't reserved for priests or sacrifices. It must show up in what we eat, in what we do with our bodies, how we treat others, how we use the gift of sexuality. Leviticus 17 reminds us that to respect the sacredness of life. 17:11 says this, life and death are in the blood. Okay? Life and death, for the life of the flesh is in the blood. Blood was not to be eaten, handled casually, or sacrificed outside the tabernacle. Why? Because blood symbolized life, and life belongs to God. To treat it flippantly was to treat the giver of life with contempt. Even the act of hunting was regulated. If someone killed an animal for food, they had to pour its blood and cover it with dirt, symbolizing reverence for the life taken. So in our modern context, we usually don't think of blood as sacred, but the principles still stand. Life matters to God. It's not disposable. It's not ours to manipulate or abuse. From the unborn to the aged, from the disabled to the foreigner, all life carries dignity because it reflects the God who gives it. And for Christians, blood is central to our faith. We are people redeemed by the precious blood of Christ. To know that is to treat the gospel and all of human life with reverence. And we uphold purity in our relationships. So chapter 18 concludes what we read this week. And it focuses on the body. This chapter outlines various unlawful sexual relations, incest, adultery, homosexuality, bestiality. God is clear. His people are not to practice what the nations around them practice. Look at 18:3. You shall not do as they do in the land of Egypt, where you lived, and you shall not do as they do in the land of Canaan, to which I am bringing you. You shall not walk in their statutes. Why? Because sexual sin isn't just a private matter. It is spiritual rebellion. It distorts the image of God and corrupts the covenant of marriage, which is meant to reflect the relationship between God and his people. I just refer you to Ephesians 5. The world treats sexuality as entertainment. God treats it as a covenant. Look at verses 24 and 25 of chapter 18. Do not make yourselves unclean by any of these things, for by all these the nations I am driving out before you have become unclean, and the land became unclean, so that I punished its iniquity, and the land vomited out its inhabitants. When a society embraces sexual sin, it is not just individuals who suffer. It's the whole culture that suffers and is affected. Moral impurity leads to spiritual decay, and eventually it leads to judgment. So in our culture, Leviticus 18 is deeply countercultural and perhaps deeply offensive to some. But truth isn't determined by majority opinion. God's standards don't evolve with social trends. They are rooted in his character and in the good design that he gave us. And as believers, we are called to live holy lives in an unholy world. That means honoring God with our bodies. It means fleeing sexual immorality. It means practicing faithfulness in marriage and purity and singleness, not to earn God's love, but because we've already received it. And so Jesus is our pattern of purity. Let's be honest. None of us have lived this perfectly, right? We've not always honored life. We've allowed lust to live in our hearts. We've looked where we shouldn't, touched what wasn't ours, and said yes when we should have said no. But here's the good news. Jesus didn't just die for the impure. He lived pure for us. He respected the sacredness of life. He honored God with his body. He was tempted in every way as we are, yet without sin. And he loved us not by taking from us, but by giving himself for us. 1 Peter 2:24. He himself bore our sins in his body on the tree, that we might die to sin and live to righteousness. By his wounds you have been healed. In Christ, you are not only forgiven, but you're made new. Do you know what you need is probably more than forgiveness, even though we need it a lot? Is we need a forgiveness that makes us new. We don't need a forgiveness that leaves us as we are. We need a forgiveness that makes us new. And by his Spirit, you can now live the life you were called to live. Holiness isn't just about the tabernacle. It's about the table, the bed, the street, and the screen. It shows up in how we treat the bodies God has given us and the people made in his image. Leviticus 17:18 calls us to moral purity, not to earn our salvation, but to reflect the God who saved us. And through Christ, we not only receive our grace for a failure, but we receive power for faithful living. Let me conclude with the big idea. God calls his people to live distinctly in a defiled world, but only Christ can make us truly clean. We are unclean, but God is holy. And through his appointed priest, his perfect sacrifice, and his Spirit at work in us, we can live lives that please him. So let me ask, where are you trying to clean yourself? Where are you still living like life is your own? And have you trusted in the one who both forgives and makes new? The good news is that Jesus has gone into the Holy of Holies once and for all. The blood has been sprinkled, the scapegoat has carried away our sin, and now by faith we are clean. So live like it. Live like it. Not proudly, but gratefully. You know what I mean by that? Don't live like you're holier than thou. Live holy, but in your living holy, live it in a way that expresses your gratitude, that expresses that this is not of my own doing, but this is the doing of someone who now lives on the inside of me. And live like it, not perfectly. You can't. And if you try to live like this perfectly, you know what will happen to you? You will be frustrated. You will find yourself ready to give up and quit. We're not called to live this perfectly. You know what we're called to do? Is to live this faithfully. Faithfully. What does that mean? When you fail, it's not over with. It's not over with. Faithfully means I have fallen, but yet I get back up. Why? Because the Bible tells me that I am clean, that I am His, and that my failure is not the end game. It doesn't mean that it's over with. So I get up. I confess my faults. And He is faithful and just to forgive me of all of my sins. And then I keep walking. I keep walking. And you do it not in fear, but you do it in freedom. Not in fear, but you do it in freedom. What kind of Christian does the world need? The Christian that we found in Leviticus 13 through 18. That's the one that the world needs. And if we'll live this kind of life, you and I, if you're a Christian, and I hope you are, if you're not, that needs to be step number one for you. We can really begin to experience what the Bible has promised us, and that is, he whom the Son has set free is what? It's free indeed. When we rest in what Christ has done. Are you resting in what He's done for you? Or are you still trying to work? Are you still trying to do? Are you still trying to earn? If you are, you'll always be weary. You'll always be tired. Your Christianity will be nothing more than a roller coaster ride, or it will cease to exist altogether. Because what you're living is not true Christianity. True Christianity rests in the work of someone else so that we can do the work that is required of us. But it finds its empowerment out of resting in what someone else has already done. Let's pray. Father, as we conclude our time together this morning, I pray that we would be energized once again by a repetitive truth in your word, which is, in order for us to live holy lives, we must rest in your holy work. We must see what you have done for us. Yes, we need to see who we are clear. And how as we've already sung about, how great and immense our sin was, but we need to see how great and immense your grace and your forgiveness is in our life. And let that overwhelm us, and let that bring peace and into our lives so that we can rest from our own efforts and begin to move and to work and to live and to have our being out of what you have already done for us. Father, we thank you for the work of Jesus. Now help us to understand it better so that we can walk closely with him. In Christ's name, amen. Stand, let's sing one more song.